Purpose of this lecture is an overview of policing and a few sort of ways to conceptualize um, how police are organized from a management perspective. Um, Recall there are three levels to the criminal justice system: police, courts, and corrections. So, police are the first segment of the criminal justice system. Their basic task is to find people suspected of crime, collect evidence for that shows that they did the crime, and then they give that to the court system, specifically what's called the prosecutor, right? And the prosecutor sometimes goes by the district attorney. You may have heard that, prosecuting attorney. Um, and that office is part of the court system, then would decide whether or not the case has enough evidence in which to proceed in the court system, which would get a conviction or a acquittal, which means they're not guilty. And then after the court, obviously, if you're not guilty, nothing else happens. But if you are found guilty and convicted, then you move on to the correction system. Okay. Um, Excuse me. Okay. Scientific police management. That's an idea that we can apply the principles of social sciences, of social science inquiry to administration of police activity to make it more efficient, basically, right? To make it better. Um, so the idea is you want to sort of read you a quote here from the lecture notes, which you should read. It's to increase the effectiveness, efficiency, and sensitivity of policing, and that means by sensitivity they mean sort of lower police or community complaints about the police. Okay, this sort of started to really come around in the 70s, and it resulted from an agency in 1969. You don't need to know this part, called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and they sort of funded a bunch of research. Okay, the most important one of which, or the seminal research projects, are very expensive to do this kind of research, was called the Kansas City experiment. Okay, and what they did in Kansas City is they had three groups, right? So they sort of chopped up neighborhoods, right? And then they randomly assigned these three groups. The control, there's no change. Okay, they just kept doing like they almost did. In other neighborhoods, they doubled patrols and assigned officers. So they doubled the amount of cops, right? And then the third type was they had no patrollers and they had sent no uniformed officers unless they were called into that neighborhood. Okay. Now, the findings are interesting because they found that there was no significant difference in crime rates, and they looked at preventable crimes, such as burglary, robbery, auto theft, larceny, vandalism, right? So those are property crimes, right? But if in the test I just say crime, that's what I mean. Okay. They found that there was no significant difference at the public fear of crime. One would expect, right, that if you saw more cops in your neighborhood, you might have a lower fear of crime in your neighborhood, right? You would also expect more patrols with lower crime, but it didn't. And then what's even more interesting is that the public wasn't even aware of any differences. So they basically contacted you and they said, "Hey, have you noticed any difference in the number of patrols you've seen in the community?" So remember, they doubled it in some, and then others they completely eliminated it, and people didn't even notice. Okay, so it suggests that the level of police patrols in a neighborhood doesn't affect these things. Okay, they did a second experiment where they looked at improving response time, right, to the police. That didn't affect the apprehensions of suspects nor citizen satisfaction. Basically, most police reports occurred long after the commission of the crime, right? So they couldn't, by the time they call the cops, the person's already gone, would be the idea. Okay. Okay, a few police agencies. You have it on three levels. You have federal, state, and local. Okay, so federal police, think of the ones you see on the TV shows, the FBI, the DEA, which is Drug Enforcement Administration, Customs, even if the ones in the military, like a really great job is to get for, I believe it's called the, I'm so sorry, you guys, about yawning. It's the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. It's a good job. They came and recruited at West Oahu one time. Okay, so those are ones that are controlled by the federal police. I'm sorry, the federal government. State police. There's not a lot in Hawaii, but I would imagine that the DNLR, Department of Natural Resources, basically they're like in Hawaii. That's what they call the fish and game, right? They'll sometimes call them fish and wildlife, fish and game, and those are generally state agencies because hunting regulations or fishing regulations apply to a whole state. But it could be highway patrol. Hawaii doesn't have one, but California has a state highway patrol, and they patrol the freeways. They don't patrol the city streets, but they patrol highways. If you had there are certain state parks, like Hawaii has state, they're not forests, but like for example, the end of the road on the west side of Oahu, Keawaula, is a state park. Okay, so some states will have cops just for their state parks. Okay. Local police, that's what most of us think of. HPD, any of the islands that have, Maui Police Department, Kauai Police Department, Hawaii Police Department, those are city or local police. The mainland has county sheriffs. Um, I don't know. I believe that the sheriffs in Hawaii are actually state level because they do the courts and the airports. So that's interesting because it's unique. Hawaii's sort of unique in its bureaucratic structure. Um, so anyway, those are some of the types of police. You also have private security firms. You may have heard of um, various security firms. Securitas is a big one. I think Securitas is sort of the successor of Brinks, which is the one you might have seen in some of the Western movies from back in the day. Okay, so basically on a test, I might say, the FBI is an example of, and you would say federal police, right? If I said highway patrol is an example of, you'd say state police. HPD, that's Honolulu, or Hawaii, that would be obviously local. Okay. Talk a little bit about something called modern police management. Basically, just a little bit about styles of policing have changed over time. Okay, so I'll just give you something that I got from a textbook. So basically, from the 1840s to the 1930s, there was very close ties between elected politicians and police. The idea is that police were used to serve the interests of the politicians, right? Um, Crime control or public order were sort of a secondary concern. From the 30s to the 70s, you saw an upsurge in more professional policing and an emphasis on crime fighting and apprehending offenders. So prior to that, basically the police department is structurally under the mayor, right? So the mayors used them for their own purposes, political purposes back in the day when there was less media and whatnot. Okay. Since the 1970s, you've seen an era of what's called community policing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But the idea is that the police are supposed to be more responsive to the needs of the community. That's more effective, not just apprehending criminals, sort of problem solving, more cooperation between, say, a church. You might, as a police agency, you may say, you know what, I'm going to partner with various churches or other organizations in the community to sort of, help affect crime rates. There's another way. I want to talk just about these three ways because It's this guy named James Q. Wilson, is a pretty famous criminologist. He sort of suggests three ways in which police departments structure their activities and goals, right? So it's sort of like management styles, if you will. Okay, now do not think of these as either or categories. There can be considerable overlap, right? But it's just sort of conceptual models to say, okay, what is this police agency? How do they tend to organize their bureaucratic structure? What is their management emphasis, if you will? Okay, so it's a conceptual tool. Think of it that way. All right, so watchman style. That is a department that is primarily oriented towards public order maintenance. The cops use a lot of discretion and informal controls to keep the peace. That's when you've seen all in the movies. Remember how the cop goes and he knows the local criminal in the one neighborhood, and he goes and he roughs them up and says, "Hey, you got to tell me when the big job's coming," that kind of stuff. But I'm not going to arrest you now. That kind of idea. Um, it's also been characterized, fairly or unfairly, as sort of the bad cop image, right, that I just described. Um, when I was a kid, there was a big gang problem, huge gang problem in Los Angeles. They were shooting each other, even in my hometown. And the Los Angeles Police Department had a reputation of using threats, physical abuse, roughing up people in the neighborhoods. Um, it's accurate to say this sort of police structure is more common in poorer neighborhoods where people lack social power, get away with it, right? And I'm not saying that people seek to do that I'm sure some agencies have done that in the past, but I'm not. I'm just sort of, again, this is just a way to conceptualize how police operate, right? Certain police departments that are less effectively run are obviously going to be more oriented towards some of the bad action. But again, think of the good part of it would be, hey, let's give the cops some discretion here, right? Legalistic style, just like it might sound, it's almost the exact opposite. There is not really discretion. Enforce the strict letter of the law. If a behavior is not a crime, it's ignored. If it is, it's prosecuted. So the police sort of want to avoid getting into disputes which aren't really their Kuliana are really their actual responsibility or purview, right? In the 1990s, you guys may have heard of a guy named Rudolph Giuliani. He was the mayor of New York, and they really sort of had this approach where they were going to bust every single crime, right? They were graffiti, spitting on the sidewalk, kind of an idea, zero tolerance idea, right? Stop and frisk, just in general. Of course, they did that in the poor neighborhoods. So, just strict letter of the law. Anything that's a crime is technically a crime, legally a crime. They're going to address it. The service style, that's the more friendly, cooperative community service type of orientation, not the non adversarial. Rather than strict law enforcement, you're using alternative sanctions. So you may refer them to social agencies, drug treatment, stuff like that. The idea here in community policing is the goals of the department should reflect the needs or desires of the community. It's been suggested it's mostly found in wealthier neighborhoods, but I would say it's also fair to say that that's a philosophy that many police departments have decided rather than an antagonistic approach. Sort of the in thing, if you will, community policing. Okay, so police community relations, PCR, these are all, it's related to that service style that we just talked about. There's various kinds. I would say they all fall under the umbrella of community policing, but they've just sort of given various types, if you will, as sort of, again, a conceptual model. Team policing. So sort of think of just in general, have you guys seen like McGruff the crime dog? It used to be, I don't know if it's still around, right? It was sort of like these advertisements about, report bad people. Dare, the drug education stuff. They used to have the little car they drove around, and they would go to the various elementary schools, and they had this curriculum. By the way, that was very bad. Studies has shown that no significance. So it's drug prevention, right? So if it worked, you would expect kids who had DARE to have less future drug use than kids who do not. And guess what? No difference. So it doesn't work. Waste of money. It's because the poor nature of the curriculum, I would say. I saw it before, and sorry, but my dissertation was on drug policy. Okay, team policing. Basically, it's more like a group of officers are assigned to a particular neighborhood. They use a lot of discretion, try to resolve matters within the community. It's kind of like the old style where cops have their own beat and people know them in the neighborhood. That kind of idea. Maybe you've seen the movie about the London Bobby. That's what they call their cops. That kind of walk around and they know people. Community policing, again, we've kind of discussed it, but it's basically some sort of enlightened law enforcement administration, right? Just really embracing the idea of the service provider. The police involve themselves in a number of community service, some of which don't even involve law breaking, right? So it is suggested actually that cops receive far more service calls than law breaking calls, and so they're kind of almost referral duties, if you will, in certain cases, right? All right, strategic policing. This would be sort of similar to what we discussed in terms of the Kansas City experiment, right? You would find your high crime areas and you would sort of strategically assign your police in a way. Maybe you're trying to take on drug networks, gangs, white collar crime, etc., mafia. Buy and bust operations, right? For drugs, right? Sort of sounds like the kind of could involve sort of paramilitary style of certain situations to me, but I could be wrong. Problem solving policing. Attempt to attack the root causes of crime, seek to improve the social conditions in neighborhoods, getting residents to start cleaning up neighborhoods. They perform educational tasks, referral to social services, job training, conflict management services. So you can see how there's overlap here, okay? Just sort of, again, various types of conceptual models that you can sort of say, well, this is a type of community policing. All right, that's it.